Welcome to Conjuredcraft. My name is Taryn, and this week I want to make something horrible. Now, why on earth do I want to make something horrible? Well, at time of recording, it's Smash Bash season. If you don't know already, Smash Bash is a free-to-enter themed miniature competition that celebrates the more evocative side of our hobby. It was started by Matt, aka Totally Not Panicking, and it's my favorite hobby competition and honestly the only one I'm ever interested in entering. The theme for this year's competition is mostly in the flesh, a suggestive prompt to be sure. Now, after a lengthy design process, and by design process I mean me worrying that I wouldn't be able to come up with anything original, interesting, or just weird enough to catch the judges' attention, I started to spiral a bit and eventually just let my mind have a break. And one night, before going to sleep, it hit me. Mostly in the flesh. The theme reminded me of the incredible work of the illustrator John Patrick Gagnas. Their piece, Midas the Touched, has lived rent-free in my brain for the past year and has been featured prominently on my future projects board over on Pinterest. Like most of my work, I'm using several photos for reference, and I'll be changing elements of the original illustration, but honestly, I'm saying fuck it to coming up with anything new and hoping that this is unhinged enough to get noticed. Working from the original art, there's a few things that I do want to adjust, the first one being Midas. From the original Greek myth, we know that Midas liked to live deliciously, and I can only imagine royalty as being more paunchy. His gold body against the flayed flesh of the Phrygians really stands out to me. However, I think I want him sitting on a gold throne, made up of his subjects, all held together, rather than just the one woman on her hands and knees. And of course, we can't forget his skin cape. I do think that would be most effective hung up on a wall, like an embroidered tapestry on the inside of a throne room, but that means I'll have to have a base and a wall. So rather than a model, I'm really manufacturing a diorama. All of this is really dependent on time, materials, and honestly, what does and doesn't hold my interest. Parameters are good for a job to keep you focused and motivated, but I'm no longer operating like this is a business, and I'm certainly not an employee. We're crafting, and if things change, so be it. If you're consistent, categorical, and crafty, you should never run out of building materials. The consistency is saving things. Every time I go down to my building's bin room, I keep an eye out for IKEA frames that renters inevitably toss out. The backing board of these frames is really thin MDF, which means it's easy to cut for all kinds of bases. Now, this method isn't as easy as just having a big box of junk. You have to know what's in your kit. And even before starting this craft, I knew categorically that I had this thick packing cardboard, which is used for shipping heavy objects. This material is amazing for building up volumes very quickly, and it will give more of a surface area for the wall of the diorama to be glued on later. Finally, to cover these messy cardboard edges, I'm just getting a little crafty. I could try to hand cut MDF or balsa wood to finish off the edges, but my cuts won't be perfectly straight, and I don't feel like sanding down material. So using some white core picture mounts, or just any thick paperboard, I can glue it to the edges of our platform and then cut the excess material with just a pair of scissors. This paperboard paints up just fine, and now the base for our diorama is ready to get decorated. Once I've measured and marked some space for the stone slab that will elevate the throne, I can start a classic form of hobby self-flagellation, cutting up lots of tiny little bricks. I'll be the first one to admit that there were other ways I could have done this base. I didn't have to make the bricks as small as I did. I could have done a simpler pattern, but I wanted something that looked unstable. I really want to drive home the shoddy, dodgy craftsmanship. I want the entire structure that we start off with to look like it's built on nothing. Once I had the initial strips of corkboard cut to length, I taped the strips together and then cut horizontally to make the individual brick shapes. Once it was all said and done, I had some leftover bricks to put away for the next time I want to torture myself with recreational tedium. The last step was to use some MDF offcuts to create elevation for the large piece of cork that fits perfectly in the center. I may add one step of elevation later on, but that's going to depend on the throne. So to make the throne exactly the way I wanted, I had to immediately break my own rule for this year, and I bought some new minis. Luckily though, I'm able to do that thanks to the support of my coven on Patreon. The kind folks over on Patreon enable me to get emergency hobby supplies so that my intrusive thoughts can experience their full glory. I genuinely believe I have one of the best communities in this hobby, and I wouldn't be able to do this without them. If you want to get these videos early and ad-free, see your name in the title sequence, or join our wall of skin, check out the links above and below, and don't worry too much about this image. In the original concept, I wanted something like William Kerr's From the Depths, casting the people in the throne more as victims, but still fighting back against the blatant immorality of billionaires. Ultimately, I decided to work with the original poses of the miniatures, since it was easier to have a bunch of ass-kissing Proud Boys permanently stuck holding up our gluttonous overlord. I'm kind of glossing over this segment, and that's because I genuinely struggled with getting the throne just right, not because this is all just an ad for my Patreon. Our king in waiting is going to begin life from this ogre that I picked up from the bits pool at Camping Kit Bash. Now, before you leave a comment asking why I would hack up a miniature rather than just sculpting it from scratch, I absolutely have the ability to make an armature, build up the forms, and eventually end up with a similar, if not better, base model. At a guess, it would take me an hour to fabricate, 3 more for the clay to cure, then coming back to refine the shapes and waiting for that to cure again, and what, we're 8 hours now if I'm doing it from scratch? Instead, I can spend 5 minutes hacking off the bits I don't need, so I save myself a bunch of clay and get close enough to the form I want in just one session. With this technique, you'll be able to leave so many comments with the time you'll be saving. I have a general idea of muscle groups and fatty tissues of the human body, so I work pretty quickly at this stage. I spend a little more time, however, being selective about the limbs. I have this pair of miscellaneous creature arms from my forbidden bits that I'm just going to use as another base. Something you might have noticed previously is that when a section of clay is finished, I'm coming back and sanding it down once it's cured completely. This is largely possible because of the mixture of clays that I'm using. I know you're going to keep asking me, but we're going to do this bit anyway. When I'm sculpting miniatures, I use two clays. They're both a type of epoxy clay. One is called green stuff, the other is milliput, in some kind of ratio of one to the other. The reason for this is that green stuff is very tacky when you mix it up. It wants to stick to everything. Milliput, on the other hand, does the opposite. On its own, it's basically impossible to get it to stick to smooth surfaces. Now, when you mix them together, I get a clay that will stick to the armature I'm working on, but isn't so sticky that my tools keep pulling it up every time I push down on it. Later on, after it's completely cured, green stuff has a plastic consistency, which keeps some flexibility in that material. Milliput, on the other hand, becomes stone hard, and that makes it a dream to cut and sand. So I'm spending way more time on this craft sanding down my work until I get a nice smooth finish. I'm not usually this meticulous, at least not on YouTube. The truth is, most of you are tapping that right hand arrow key right now and only watching maybe 30% of this video. But, feel free to go back to the beginning and prove me wrong. Once I had some clay down for the legs, I decided to speed things along by borrowing some boots off of another miniature, so no free feet pics today. The last detail to tackle on our king is his hands, and in one of them is going to be a little piggy. I wanted Midas to hold something in his fist, like a severed head, a sword, a scepter, something interesting just to sort of break up the symmetry of the piece. And I had my coven vote on it, and unsurprisingly, the pig won Best in Show. It's finally time to start the real star of this piece. With the MDF wall that I cut earlier to make up the backdrop of our diorama, I'm sketching pretty much exactly the same silhouette as my reference image. There's no sense in being coy about it. I think it's the best part of the illustration, and it's why I started this maddening endeavor to begin with. The main difference is that I will be making far more panels. Tons and tons of 28mm-ish panels of skin. Using my blend of epoxy clays, I start by making the rectangle patches that go down either side of the quilt to give myself a perimeter to slowly fill inside. I switch between sculpting some patches and then sketching up the lines for the basic pattern I'm after. For some extra detail, I've cut down some specimen pins and then pushing the heads of those into the clay to give an impression that it's been nailed into the wall. Initially, I also put some small holes in a few of the panels as a poor attempt to create the illusion that they've been stitched together, but these holes were too large and too frequent, so I did go back and cover up the majority of them. I'm quite comfortable in admitting that I'm incredibly ignorant when it comes to fabric or leather work. I don't know much about the history of these materials, the styles, types of patterns, stitching, and so on. But with that being said, I am making a tiny, giant wall hanging of human skin. So let's all just forgive any historical or technical inaccuracies here. For the actual sculpting, I'm using a fine needle tool, which ironically is a sewing needle that I pinned into a paintbrush handle. I'm leaving the surface quite rough for painting later on, but occasionally using 120 grit sandpaper to add more texture. I can't imagine that Midas or his servants did a great job in preserving the hide during the tanning process. Finally, the main attraction on our human quilt, lots of tiny leather faces. I didn't film a lot of this because it took me 3 full days of sculpting. And yes, I could have made a mold or a stamp to cheat some of this, but there's a reason why I wanted every single face to be unique. Each of the faces on this wall represent a member of my coven, so I didn't want to cheat anyone from their moment. The basic steps to making these little faces is to roll out a section of clay, score the edges to get your shape, then push in with the needle tool to make the nostrils. After that, do the same for the eyes, and finally carve out the mouth. It's not the prettiest result every time, but that's exactly what we're after. The other major feature for this leather wall ornament are some more complete bodies. I did a rough sketch of what I was after, a flipped pattern of torsos, arms, and legs, and took my time filling out the remaining gaps until our cursed tapestry was complete. And after a week of sculpting, sanding, cutting, gluing, we can finally see this scene coming together. I try to think about painting now the same way that I do about cooking. I always pull up a recipe to get a general idea of what I'm after, but I'm always going to freestyle the measurements because no one's using enough seasoning. I found a tutorial from Mugs of Doom minis for a vibrant sandstone color, which you can watch if you want the recipe, but here's my take on it. The sandstone was accomplished by giving everything a zenithal prime, base coating in an ochre yellow, and then selectively painting the low points with a plum shade of red. Afterwards, I mixed up a pale sand to overbrush everything quite vigorously, so that the stone looks more sun-bleached. Finally, I mixed up a rusty shade of brown to wash everything back down. For this, I used a larger brush head to wet the surface and then applied the wash, letting it slide into all the nooks and crannies. Before it dried, I came back with a cloth and gently took off the wash on the highest points. And honestly, I think this is one of the best bases I've ever painted. Once I hit everything with a coat of varnish to protect my work, I went over each of the fanatics with 2 coats of black paint. Then I applied a high quality metallic gold that I originally bought for some home DIY. So straight up at this point of the project, I got sick, and the final result isn't exactly what I wanted in regards to the skin tones, but I think the process of what I did is still worth covering. To start off, I made a few mixes of a high quality red paint with some cheap dollar store black. If you remember my scabs video from last month, there's a mini art lesson there where I cover this bit of color theory a bit more, but that black paint pushes us closer to a deep purple. So the base colors of our skin vary from blood red to red wine. When mixing the midtones, I made sure to include that same red paint in every step, using less and less of it as I added more layers, until finally, instead of doing the usual highlights you would for painting skin, I washed everything down in another rusty brown mix. This helped me get closer to an effect I could live with and has the added benefit of hiding the messy transitions from the quilt to the wall. Finally though, it's time to finish Midas. Unfortunately, we did have some unpleasantness during priming, and his nose is no longer with us. I really should spin this as a positive though about how good the rest of my sculpting is, since nothing else broke on the model. But after some rhinoplasty and repriming, we could steal our last painting tutorial from the creator of Smash Bash himself, Matt. I'm not hoping for any bonus points by doing this. I know full well that the judges aren't watching this video. I only follow Matt's advice through the underpainting stage and then freestyle with some original herbs and spices. So instead, let's talk a little bit more about the context of this piece. I don't think you need to be a genius to figure this out, but in case this video survives the inevitable resource wars, or you as a viewer in 2025 lack cultural context, this King Midas is a fat ruler, a sadistic one, who's said to have a golden touch. He's sitting on a crumbling, faulty foundation, wearing the skin of his victims. Behind him is an even more miserable tapestry, proudly showing the world that he's a malicious mass murderer. Despite this cruelty and bloodshed, there are people who still flock to him, people who openly choose to support him and prop him up. They themselves are also falling victim and being turned into golden statues and are none the richer for it. I don't think for one second that anybody was conned into supporting this tyrant. I think these people wanted to take that risk. And look, regardless of all that, in the end, they just end up as more casualties of the corrupt tyrant. Shiny, golden, boot-licking casualties. Speaking of being conned, I don't know how I tricked myself into doing two massive projects back to back. But thankfully, I'm off to Adepticon and then Salute right after that, so if I do any crafting over the next month, it will have to fit in my suitcase. Now, if you're at either of those events, do feel free to come by and say hi to me. I am far less normal in person. Thank you again to my coven for being on board with my unhinged ideas. If you would like to join and potentially get asked for a flesh donation, check out my Patreon for ad-free videos, in-depth write-ups about my project ideas, and beautiful photography of every craft. If you want to give me a few dollars and then cancel, that's absolutely fine, because I am now completely out of epoxy clay. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm really happy you're here. Until next time, I'll see you soon.